Our reading this morning is from the first letter of Peter, chapter 4, verses 8 through 11 on page 234 in your pew Bible. Above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. Whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies, so that God may be glorified in all things through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. This is the word of God for the people of God.
I have to say, coming back and being here after being in the Middle East where a congregation half our size would have outsung you already in very guttural sort of praise music, I can tell that today we're kind of in a mellow mood. We're sort of in a quieter space. And you know what? That's okay. The way we worship and the way we come together is we come to God with whatever we have that morning to bring, and we are whoever God calls us to be on a morning like this. After all, as we've been dealing since the beginning of the fall with sort of looking at what it means to be a neighbor and a community, and now we're moving into that place of what does it mean to actually witness to other people, to speak the gospel. You know, it always doesn't come with a loud, clangy, big, showy bell. It sometimes comes in those quieter moments of us being with one another. In fact, what we're talking about today, a shift from last week where didn't Ashley do a great job last week, by the way? I mean, she's not here, but I thought when I listened to her sermon how she spoke about that cloud of witnesses, and she talked about cheering and how those people around us that really help us feel loved. That was an amazing way to think about that we are also called to be clouds of witnesses for other people. We are part of a community of people, a whole bunch of people that God may maneuver into a person's life so that they understand or come to know for themselves the love and grace of mercy of Jesus Christ. But today we're going to talk about it from a little different lens. We're going to talk about sort of biblical hospitality. And so what does that mean to be welcoming, to invite and to welcome? Well, the first thing I want to say about that is that, you know, there's a difference between hospitality, isn't there, and entertaining. Right? When we entertain, what do we usually do? We clean up our houses. We put on the fanciest menu that we can come up. We often are dressed in our best. And really, we're inviting people into our home. And to some degree, it's a beautiful and wonderful experience. But sometimes it can feel intimidating to those who don't have those gifts. How many of you have not ever wanted to invite people over because your house wasn't clean enough? Or you didn't think you were a good enough cook, right? There's something about our American sense of entertaining. Maybe it's all those videos, but now even in the days of the Food Network where you feel like you have to be able to cook something exotic and perfect. And man, if your house doesn't look like a poster for some interior design magazine, don't bother, right? Why would you want to invite someone into our spaces? And so where do most of us meet up with people these days? In restaurants and coffee shops. Because that intimate space of our lives, we feel too exposed, too vulnerable. But you know what? The Bible doesn't talk about hospitality as entertaining. That's not at all what it's talking about. In fact, the Bible, when it talks about hospitality, isn't even talking about fellowship. It's not even talking about, okay, Christian hospitality or biblical hospitality is about us getting together with other Christian people. That's kind of a shock, isn't it? Like, isn't that what it's supposed to be about? And of course, the church is supposed to be welcoming, and there's nothing wrong with entertaining. But you know the Greek origins of the word hospitality in the verse that we just read? The word is philostenos, and that means love of stranger. In Christian hospitality, biblical hospitality, Old Testament hospitality, whatever you want to call it, it's meant to be the reaching out to the person who's different from you. The one who's the, quote, other, the stranger, the someone who's not like you. And the biblical understanding of spirituality is always about being willing to cross some sort of boundary or barrier and welcoming that person in. In the sense of biblical hospitality, there's always a quality of an open heart, an open home, and open hands that are offered for the sake of the stranger. Let's just sort of focus on that first thing, an open heart. You know, I have to say, I was thinking about it the other day. Here I'm flying back from the Middle East, and I'm thinking, 10 years ago, believe it or not, I had never been to Israel or Palestine. In fact, 10 years ago, I'd hardly ever met anyone from that region in the country, or the world. I'd always wanted to go, but I had never had the opportunity. If you had asked my, self 10 years ago, would I have had such a strong connection to the people of the Middle East, I would have laughed at you. I had no reason to think I ever would. In fact, I had no reason to think that I would really, even for all the multiculturalism in the Bay Area, much of that is in the Pacific Rim and India. But I had really never met or talked to a Muslim person 10 years ago. Maybe I had, but I had never really had a real relationship with people. And yet here I am, traveling all the way across the world because the people there have become like family to me. That something shifted in me, an open-heartedness to the people there. But I have to say, not unlike many people, I had never been in a mosque until I was in the town of Hebron, a place of great conflict in that place. And I didn't know what I would feel walking into a mosque for the first time. I wasn't really sure, because of my own socialization, what it would feel like to actually engage and become a friend with a Muslim who might think and see the world so differently from the way I do. I had never picked up a Quran. I had never engaged any of this. And because of what I didn't know, there was an element of fear that lingered underneath the surface in those relationships. It was just, I don't know what to expect. Who's going to guide me? Am I going to be safe? Am I going to say the wrong thing? How are we going to make these connections? And yet, that place of Christian hospitality calls us to be open-hearted to the people that God brings into our lives. And there's one man that is brought into my life in a sort of open-hearted way. It's the person that's very unexpected to me. He's a taxi driver. And it turns out that this taxi driver, I've only met him 4 years ago, has often been the person who ends up taking me to the airport, picking me up at the airport or picking me up. His name is Mohammed. He's kind of this crazy guy with a wonderful Middle Eastern accent in English, and he's just passionate and lovely and all these things. And even the first time I met him, I didn't even pay attention to him. It was like one of those, I had to go to the airport at 2 in the morning. I could have cared less. I was so exhausted, so tired, and I'm like, yeah, just get me to Tel Aviv. I don't really care who you are. And then the second time I realized he took me, I said, wait a minute, didn't I meet you before? And he said, yeah, I drove you once before. And I thought, oh, maybe I should pay attention. And it turns out now he's probably done about 8 round trips with me back and forth to the airport. And Mohammed's just an interesting guy. He lives in a village within the city of Jerusalem, a Muslim village within the city of Jerusalem. He's an optimistic guy. He has 3 children, and since I've met him, he's had he had 2, and then he had 1 more. And the banter in their car has sort of been about that, and what's the latest going on with his kids and that kind of stuff. But then it was interesting. Last spring, when we were there in April, we got talking about places to eat. And I was trying to goad him into inviting me to his house for lunch or dinner or something, and that didn't work. But I tried anyway, and the reason was that he told me he was celebrating Ramadan, and he was fasting. And I'm like, Mohammed, I didn't think you really believed any of that stuff. And he said, no, I don't, but I just want to do Ramadan. He said, I just feel like it'll be helpful for my spirituality or something. So I didn't talk much more to him about it until I arrived at the airport this time, and who's picking me up? Could have been a number of drivers that I have, but it was Mohammed again who was given the opportunity to bring me to my hotel room. And so I said to Mohammed, Mohammed, tell me, how did Ramadan end up going for you? What was that like? And for the first time in all of these round trips, we got into a pretty serious conversation about his own faith, and then the faith of his children, because his son is now going to Friday prayers at the mosque. And I was talking to him about, how does that feel to be a father who's not leading your son into that religious experience? And what was Ramadan like for you as a person of sort of faith, non-faith? And we just had a quiet conversation. I said, well, have you considered going to the mosque more often and praying, exploring that part of your spirituality? And then it was time. Our 45-minute drive was over, and he dropped me off, only to pick me up on Thursday when my way was coming back home. But this time I had a story to tell him, because for the first time ever, I had the opportunity to go inside the Dome of the Rock. Normally, non-Muslim people aren't allowed on that platform. We're allowed on the platform to visit and wander around, but not to actually be in the sacred places of the Muslim people. The mosque there is the iconic vision of Jerusalem that you all are aware of, is forbidden, actually. We're not allowed as Christians or as Jewish people to be inside that building. But this particular time, because I had connections with people who run the security of that place, they allowed us the opportunity to go in. And so on that drive to the airport, I talked to Mohammed about that. I asked if he'd ever been in there. Of course he had. And I talked about my experience. It was really quite an astonishing experience being in that place. On that particular rock that the Muslims venerate is also what's projected to be the Holy of Holies from the Jewish faith. And after Jerusalem was taken by the Christians, it also housed a Christian church for many centuries. But for the last 14, 15 centuries, it's been a Muslim holy place. For me, when I walked inside the Dome of the Rock, the song that kept singing through my head was, "I'm standing on holy ground." It was really quite an amazing experience. I was unexpected. It was beautiful, but it felt like the sort of the confluence of all these three Abrahamic religions were sort of present in that physical space. And I mentioned this to Mohammed on our drive. And then our conversation went deeper. I think because there's been an openness of heart for me to care about Mohammed and his family and to have these beginning conversations, he began to talk to me about the places where he had felt the Spirit moving in his life. And he told me that the most profound experience he's ever had was at the tomb of Christ in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He said, when I walked in there, Debbie, he said, I don't know what to make of it. All the hairs on my arm stood up. And I knew there was something about that place, that God was present. I don't even know what that means. And the two of us had the most amazing conversation about thin places, those places where God seems to break through and is so present to human beings. This Muslim sort of agnostic and this Christian pastor in this Jewish country are having the most astonishing conversation about things that really matter. It was just a moment, and as often happens with Muhammad, even though within the Muslim faith they're really not supposed to have physical contact with women, as we got out of the car and he dropped me off at the airport, he gave me a good big hug and said, I can't wait to see you when you come back. That's that open-heartedness, to be open to someone whose experience and religious vocabulary is completely different from your own. It's that open-heartedness that all of us need to develop a sensitivity to what kind of relationships is God calling us to be in with other people. Being attentive, listening, really listening to the soul underneath the things that people are telling, and then being willing to enter into that sacred ground of conversation about our faith. And even when those faiths are not the same, it's amazing what God can bring together in those moments. But the other thing about Christian hospitality is not just about being open-hearted, it's about having an open home. You know, one of the things that we need to think about in this welcoming the stranger or inviting people in is this willingness to be vulnerable enough to invite people into our lives right where we are. Whether the dishes are clean or the house is picked up or it looks like a Pinterest post, just to invite people into our lives and allow that sort of vulnerable, authentic life to be shared by one another. Yesterday I was reading a story, a rather astonishing story actually, about Christian hospitality by a woman who was an English professor at Syracuse University. She was head of the English department and head of the Women's Studies division at Syracuse University, and she was as anti-Christian as you can imagine. And she writes about how she just thought Christianity was this parochial, crazy religion, and she really didn't have any interest in it. And what got her sort of on the roadmap was that she wrote an op-ed piece in her local paper because Promise Keepers was coming to Syracuse University, and she was protesting, leading a protest against the university allowing them to come and use their space. And she says, when she describes this, she said she got a bunch of hate mail. She stuck it all in a little file. She got a bunch of love mail. She stuck that all in a file. But she said she got one letter that she didn't know what to do with. She couldn't figure out if it was hate mail or if it was love mail. And it was from the local Reformed Presbyterian pastor. And this pastor, instead of saying he disagreed with her or he liked her, he said, I think we may see things differently, but I'm wondering if you'd be interested in having a conversation. I'd be really interested in why you've come to your conclusions if we could have a conversation. She said she didn't know what to do. She actually threw the letter away, and she said about the next day she actually fished it out of the garbage can because it was so different from any other letter that she'd written. Because at the bottom, this man said he and his wife would love to have her over for dinner, just to have a conversation to get to know each other. Well, she said, I went to that dinner thinking for sure that what was coming was a slam on all my ideas, on my sexuality, on my philosophy of life, and of course an invitation to heaven, so I wouldn't go to hell, and probably an invitation to church. So she was really prepared to go to this dinner and then leave within about a half hour. Except she said what was different was she said, when I walked in the home, they welcomed me. And I became immediately aware that they were interested in me. And they sat and they listened. And there were no judgments about her lifestyle. There were no condemnation of her feminism. There was no judgment about even her condemnation of Promise Keepers. There was just an openness to listen and a welcome. But to make a long story short, those dinners turned into dinners at her house and back and forth until, without them asking, she eventually came to church. She began to read the Bible, and she said, I am the least likely convert that you could ever imagine to Christianity. But it came because someone opened their home to me, their lives to me, friendship to me. You see, when we open our homes, we have to serve as hosts. It's all about the other person. And, you would never invite a newcomer into your home and then pick a fight with them, would you? Theologically, politically, that would just be wrong. The person who was the guest would say, why on earth did you invite me over? But when you invite someone, a stranger or someone, or to even use the word as she said, we were enemies. We would have been perceived as enemies in that situation. When they invited me over, they invited me as a guest, and then they showed an enormous amount of hospitality. And that hospitality turned into friendship, which created a real dialogue. She said, even though we may not have agreed on many, many things, and still may not today, she said, I always knew they cared about me, they cared about what I thought about, and that I was loved. That's where that open home concept comes from in Christianity. Not just welcoming someone into your physical space, but into your life. And then finally, the scriptures talk about, in this passage in 1 Peter, talks about service. It says that not only are we be hospitable, but that we are to serve as if with the very strength that Christ gives us, with the gifts that we've been given. And that reminds me of a story of a woman that I knew in Berkeley. Her name was Kiki. And Kiki was one of the people who came to, similar to our community dinner, except we call it a homeless meal. It was for people who were on the poverty level in Berkeley. And like our church here, I had done it every month, twice a month for years and years and years and years. And Kiki was one of those people that came into that ministry as a, quote, as a client or as a guest to that ministry. But it became really apparent that Kiki didn't want to just simply receive a meal. She wanted to serve. And so when she first said she wanted to start working in the kitchen, we were a little alarmed because Kiki has AIDS. And we weren't really quite sure where to place her and what that would mean and all the anxiety that goes along with that. But Kiki said, I want to serve. I don't want to just be the recipient. I really want to be a contributor. And so we made it work. We said, okay, we need to find out exactly what that means. And she became a really integral part of our ministry to homeless people. And then Kiki, because of who she is and that serving, became sort of this person who could really relate to many of the guests who were at our meal in a way that maybe I couldn't as a sort of highly educated person who had a home and lots of privilege. But Kiki could talk to them and talk their language, and the spirit of love that Kiki brought was just stunning. And then Kiki, even though she had just started coming to church herself, started inviting people from the meal into church, saying, this is a group of people who will love you and care about you. You see, in Kiki's place, it wasn't, I only want to be a recipient, I want to have a relationship, she said. I don't even want to be related to, I want to be friends with at a community building. And service is one way that that happens. We serve with each other. We don't serve just alongside, we form a relationship, and even the people we're serving, we have to be careful that we're not just doing it for someone, but that we work together. She sort of changed all of our attitudes from sort of that privileged person who's helping the poor to recognizing that this was a give and take relationship, and we began to invite the people that were involved in that ministry to take more ownership of that ministry, to be involved in the decision making of that ministry. You see, what the scriptures is saying is whether you're just riding a cab, or whether you're opening up your home to talk or meet with someone who's not like you at all, or whether you're serving alongside of each other, the scriptures in 1 Peter say we're supposed to do that with the words and the attitude and the love of Christ. In fact, this passage starts off and it says, do everything, be constant in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. We have to take those courageous steps to enter into those places of welcome and hospitality to people who are not like us, to learn from them, to listen to them, to empathize with them, to have a real relationship with them. And even in the middle of that, believe me, I make mistakes all the time. We stumble and we fall in our ways that we talk to one another. But because love has been the reason why we have reached out, why we have opened our homes, why we're willing to serve in that messiness of life together, love is the thing that covers up all those foibles, because grace is allowed to speak. Grace is allowed to shine. And Jesus can shine through us. As a church, we are so good at doing good things. It's a little harder for us to enter into that place of actually sharing our faith, sharing our struggles, sharing and being authentic, being fluent in those areas of spirituality. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we navigate those kinds of fears. But for this week, let us remember and hold as we move out and enter into this Advent season, as we think about all these things that our church is doing, where are the places and the people that God is calling you to reach out, to invite, and then welcome people into your lives, into our community, and into the very grace of God. Amen.